Well, hello everybody. In this video, what I want to talk about is my childhood impression of Jesus as a Jewish child, growing up in the United Kingdom. I came to faith in believing that Jesus was the Messiah at the age of 18, and I maintained that faith for 42 years. I no longer believe that Jesus is the Messiah and has no place in Judaism, but I held this faith for 42 years. And of course, coming to that faith at the age of 18, I think the expression is it wasn't in a vacuum, maybe, but this I realise is only through hindsight. I wouldn't have realised that at the time. I didn't realise that at the time. Or maybe I don't know. But it's just occurred to me now at the age of 60, right? And I want to be really, really honest with you so that you can have an understanding of my Jewish childhood view of Jesus and how I think it might have been a contributory reason for me believing in Jesus or being willing to consider him or anything like that. I leave it you as a listener to make your own mind up, but I'm going to just try and be honest as possible with the insight I've got at the moment. I was born in 1955 to an Orthodox Jewish family. My mother and father were second cousins, so everybody looked alike, right? I always felt as a child different from the non-Jewish children. I did experience anti-Semitism. I was terrified of the cross, the crucifix around children's necks, because I was frightened they'd be beating me up. My two older brothers did get beaten up and were called Christ killer and Jew killer and everything else. And I was terrified that was going to happen to me. So I lived in fear of being beaten up as a child. Although no non-Jewish child did threaten to beat me up for killing Jesus, it was because it happened to my brothers and I was frightened it would happen to me, which is understandable. The first junior school I went to I was the only Jewish child in the whole of the school. The whole of the school, I was the only Jewish child, and I was very much aware of this. And I was permanently afraid of Christian children seeing that cross round the necks and just hearing mutterings of Christ killer and things. I just remember it as being in the background and just feeling frightened of non-Jewish children. I did have, I was friendly with some non-Jewish children, and I remember thinking, isn't this amazing that they're prepared to talk to me, a Jew? Now, I want to keep on track because this is about my impressions of Jesus. The first image I saw of Jesus was on I can see it now, Jesus holding the lantern. It might have been on a Christmas card, right? Because you would see Christmas cards in the shops. You go to the shops to buy sweets. You could be anywhere. And there are Christmas cards, and there was Jesus holding a lantern, and it could have been Easter as well. He's holding the lantern, and I thought this was a photograph of Jesus. I thought he looked like that, and I thought, doesn't he look nice? He looks so nice. I do like him. I actually liked him, because I thought that's what he looked like. I even thought he walked around with a halo on his head. That's what I actually thought. So I believe that this was like a photograph of Jesus. I don't think it occurred to me it was a painting. I just thought this is what he looks like. And I thought, isn't he nice? So I actually thought he looked nice. And I thought, I wish I could believe in him because he looks so nice. I had some Irish Catholic school friends as a child, and they went to mass religiously, and I knew that they bowed down to this Jesus, and I somehow the idea of bowing down to this Jesus appealed to me. This is also awful. I feel so ashamed, but it appealed to me. There was something about it just seemed romanticism, just something about the bowing down and kneeling and the images and the blissful expressions that on faces. There were nuns, there was a convent near me, and I used to look at the nuns and they used to look blissfully happy. And again, I associated it with this Jesus. And so I think I was thinking in my mind that this Jesus could make me blissfully happy, because they always seem to look serene. So it's like a dual thing. On the one hand, I was terrified of this name Christ because I was frightened of being beaten up like my brothers. But on the other hand, I had the image from the Christmas cards and the Easter cards and things like that. It could have been even posters outside church. You know, these things are around you and you can't avoid them if you're going to school and you're passing a church and they've got a picture there up. He did look to me very nice and gentle and understanding, and I remember feeling I wish I could believe in him, but obviously I can't because I'm Jewish. I do remember actually thinking that as a child. And what else? I think this image of Jesus, this image that I took of him holding the lantern, I think it's behold I stand at the door and knock. I think that's where it's coming from, some painting or something, famous painting. It is so strong in my mind, I can even see it now, that it should have such an effect on me. This picture, just a picture. And so I was wanting to believe in him. I liked the idea. I also loved watching programs about nuns on television. I loved the nun story with Audrey Hepburn. I liked that. It somehow appealed to me, sort of spending my life, sort of bowing down. You know, even though there were there were idols, but there was something about it that appealed to me, of this kneeling down and bowing down, and this, you know, they look so blissful, the nuns, when they're praying or singing, and that, the whole nun thing really appealed to me. And I think I also used to read books, you know, by nuns, and I think the whole religious life of fascinated me, of being a nun and giving your life over to something like that, and this kind of spiritual euphoria, really, isn't it? You know, this bliss. And again, that made a very deep impression on me. The convent round the corner from where I lived, I would see the nuns every day walking up and down, walking up and down. They never looked at me, but I was always looking at them. And I remember thinking, do they know I'm Jewish? And if they can recognise I'm Jewish, would they still be looking at me in a nice way, or what would their expression change? Because again, I was very frightened of the non-Jewish world because of our history of persecution. I didn't live in a particularly Jewish area. There's two sides of the city. One side was very, very Jewish and the other side was not so Jewish. But I did go to Cheder, which is the equivalent of Sunday school. I went to a secondary school at 11 or 12. Oh, I know. Prior to that, I had to be moved to another junior school. I think because I was continually frightened that I might be attacked at this junior school. I can't remember all the details. I think they decided to move me to a school where there was a mixture of Jewish and non-Jewish children. But of course, I remember being in assembly and saying the Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. I remember saying it and liking it and liking saying it. And then I remember being pulled out of the school assembly. No, you shouldn't be here, you're Jewish. And so there was only about 4 of us Jewish children. And of course, we then kept to ourselves. We didn't go to the school assembly. But I remember even then liking saying that prayer, you see. So again, there was this attraction to Christianity. That, this... I went to a high school at 11 or 12, and it was a new system that came into play in the United Kingdom, whereby schools became what was called comprehensive. So they were massive. These were merging different schools together. So you would have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of children. So from a school being perceived and experienced as somewhere small and cosy and nice, it suddenly became massive buildings, 2 lots of buildings. You had to commute by bus, and it just suddenly became for me a very forbidding and frightening environment. And of course, again, there weren't many Jewish children, and again I was frightened. I just didn't feel safe in the non-Jewish world, because the children that I did know, obviously, the lives were so different. Like my mother, Jewish cooking, she used onions and things like that. And in those days, non-Jewish people didn't use onions. I don't know, they didn't use many onions. And I just remember in a non-Jewish home was so different to a Jewish home. And I remember feeling sort of a bit embarrassed that because I was aware I was so different from the non-Jewish world, in that we had, different festivals and a different diet, and I felt very much always frightened of the non-Jewish world. It felt a threat, and you see, but this shouldn't be surprising, because this was 15 years, say, after the Holocaust. Right. My parents, when they had me, were middle-aged, so they knew all about the Holocaust. My father had fought in the Second World War, so you had the Holocaust hanging over my childhood as well. So there was the fear of Christians, but also attracted in a sort of romantic way to this Jesus figure on cards, on Christmas cards, and seeing that Jesus in a manger again at Christmas. I liked that. I did like that. It really appealed to me. And I thought, I wish we could celebrate Christmas, because I liked it. I liked all these Christian Christmas cards, and the singing and the hymns, and Silent Night and Holy Night and Born in a Manger, and all of that. And it really did. I liked it. I liked it. I did like it. I do admit it. I remember thinking again, I wish we could sing those songs. I wish I could sing those songs. Of course you couldn't, because you're Jewish. You don't sing carols. And so it's all sort of tied up together. I eventually, at the age of 12 or 13, was moved to a Jewish high school, and that for me, I think, sealed my identity as a Jew. I had been to the Jewish Youth Club, but this really sealed my identity as a Jew, because here right, how did it seal my identity as a Jew? We celebrated every possible Jewish what's called, holy days, festivals, even probably days that perhaps ordinary Jewish people will have never heard of. We had to have days off for everything, that every little thing that was considered a religious day in Judaism, we had to have the day off. Because, everything was, observed. It was following the Orthodox Judaism line. We were very aware of the Holocaust. We weren't taught I wasn't taught anything about the Holocaust. Because in those days, you have to remember, this would have been 1967 onwards, which is not long after the Holocaust. There was no teaching about the Holocaust. All we knew was we would see photographs in books of people getting onto trucks or arriving somewhere, and they would be in clothes or they would be in striped uniforms. We never saw any pictures of gas chambers or dead bodies, nothing like that, because the thinking then was, this is even too hard for adults to assimilate. We can't expect children of 12 and 13 to take all this on board. I couldn't have coped with it. I think the thing that sealed my identity was reading at the age of 13 or 14 the Diary of Anne Frank. And that to me, and it's every Jewish girl reads that at about the age between 12 and 14. That is the book of passage for every Jewish girl to read, the Diary of Anne Frank. And that was her experience of hiding from the Nazis. And that really did seal my identity as a Jew. The school was situated in an Orthodox Jewish area, so there was a path running along the school, and you would sit in the classes by the window. I remember you'd sit there and you'd see all the yeshiva students, that's the seminary students, they're studying, the equivalent like Jewish theology and that, and they'd be all in black with the black hats and the black, the long side curls and the black coats and everything, and they'd be walking up and down, up and down. I do remember sitting by that window and watching them up and down and thinking, these are my people. I think it's the Diary of Anne Frank that sealed my identity, and seeing these Orthodox Jews continually walking up and down the passageway by the school where we would sit for every lesson, sit by the window looking at them up and down, up and down. And I had a teacher, Mrs. Barb Goulis, who was a survivor of Auschwitz, and of course, because obviously she was Orthodox, she wore shekel, which is a wig, and she had long-sleeved blouses, which all Orthodox women wear, but she had numbers tattooed on her arm. We knew that, but we never asked. I mean, it would just be unthinkable. You wouldn't show us your tattoos. It's just no way. But looking back, she was used to get distressed very easily. She couldn't manage the class. The kids were very naughty. She would get in a state and very distressed at the naughtiness of the children. And we didn't realise then, but I realise now that, that for her was a very stressful job, bearing in mind she was a Holocaust survivor. There was another teacher, again a Holocaust survivor, and again he used to get in a state with the children when they were naughty. He would just get into screaming fits. He wasn't nasty, but the children would wind him up and he would get into a state. And I now realise, we didn't realise then, you don't at 13 or 14, he wasn't strong, he wasn't well enough to be doing a job with 13, 14-year-olds. He might have been better teaching at a university or something, or some environment where the kids want to learn, but trying to cope with children who are disruptive and naughty and constantly trying to wind you up and things, as teenagers do with teachers. He couldn't cope with it either, and I could see that, and I feel awful now because it wasn't a suitable profession for either of these two people, of Holocaust survivors, to be in, because they weren't emotionally strong enough to cope with the stress of teaching, because the stress of it, everybody acknowledges the stress of teaching. And I think I've veered off the subject because you've come to listen about my Jewish impressions of Jesus. But so I'm going to go back on track. We weren't taught anything about the New Testament. The New Testament was forbidden. I'd never seen it. We weren't told anything about Jesus, only that I don't even know if we were told he was Jewish. I think perhaps it was intimated he was Jewish in some way, but we were told that he was like a rogue Jew. He was a false Messiah. He was like a very, very bad person. But it was never explained. We were never taught. Kids being kids would ask the teachers, the Jewish teachers, why don't we believe in Jesus? And the teachers would never answer us. They'd just say it's not our religion. But to be fair to the teachers, they wouldn't have been allowed to tell us anything about Jesus, because this was an Orthodox school, Jewish school. And the thinking then in the 1960s was, you don't educate about Christianity. There was no such thing about, understanding other religions and things. We knew enough to know that the Christians had persecuted us, and that was sufficient. And the headmaster wouldn't have allowed it. The Jewish community wouldn't have allowed it at that time. Teaching about Christianity, a complete no-no. Teaching about Jesus, a complete no-no. And we just knew he was like a rogue Jew, a bad Jew. Somebody was a false Messiah, like one or two other false Messiahs. I'd never read the New Testament. It was forbidden. It was considered, in my mind, to be evil. I didn't know, you might find this hard to believe, but I didn't really twig. Even at school, at high school, 14 and 15, I don't think the penny dropped that I really thought he was Jewish. I didn't realise the story was set in Israel. I knew absolutely nothing about Jesus. I didn't know the disciples were Jewish. I thought they were all Christians. I thought they were non-Jews. When I read the New Testament for the first time at age 18, this was for the first time. I still thought St. Paul was a non-Jew. I thought all these Matthew, Mark, Luke and John were non-Jews. I was very surprised when I read the New Testament for the first time. And I thought, oh, this is set in Israel, the Jewish. They're all Jewish, all these characters. I think that blew me away. I remember feeling very angry and resentful, because I thought, I should know this because I'm Jewish. Shouldn't I know that they were Jewish? Why didn't anybody tell me that St. Paul was Jewish? Why didn't they tell me that? Because I didn't know anything, and I thought I should have been taught this. I remember feeling very angry about that at the time, as you do when you're a teenager. Why haven't I been told that the disciples of Jesus were Jewish? Or that I didn't even, honestly, I didn't even realise that Jesus had been crucified in Israel. I knew nothing. I mean, I was so sheltered. It's almost embarrassing, but to me it was just like a religious figure holding that lantern. And I'd always liked him. I considered him kind and nice. But so I think what we're talking about, we've got two versions going on. We've got the idealised child version of this nice man, kind man, with a kind face, holding a lantern, looking very sweet and understanding and harmless. And then you've got the history of the persecution of the church, of the Jewish people, which I was well aware of, and very, very, very well aware of. And seeing a cross anywhere would frighten me. It would immediately become frightened. If I saw a cross anywhere, it would frighten me, because I associated that cross with the persecution. I do remember as a child being asked, why did you kill Jesus? Or something. Things like that. I just remember being terrified of Jewish children seeing that cross round their neck, because I knew that was responsible for the persecution. And of course my brothers were had been beaten up. They were really beaten up after school. Oh yeah, they were followed home and called Christ killer, Christ killer. And because I was living in fear that would happen to me. I was such a timid, frightened child. I can't begin to tell you. I was a really frightened, timid child. I didn't really mix, now to be honest, with non-Jewish children much as a child. There was a Irish Catholic family lived not far away, and I used to be going into their home quite a bit. I do remember being amazed that they should accept me, because there didn't seem to be any anti-Semitism at all. Not even the parents. They knew I was Jewish and yet they accepted me. I think that made a deep impression on me. My actual experience of Catholics as a child was actually very good. I do remember a Catholic priest. I knew he was a Catholic priest. We were going to shul, probably Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and he looked at me, and I was carrying the prayer book, right? So he would know, and we're all dressed up as Jewish people do when they're going to shul, you know. They stood out like a sore thumb, you know, dressed up, you know, like you're going to a wedding or something from a non-Jewish point of view. And I remember him looking at me with such affection, and it was the same look that I saw on the face of Jesus in the Christmas cards and things. And I remember thinking, oh, he likes me. He seems to like me and he knows I'm Jewish. I remember that bowled me away. So my experience from Catholics as a child was actually very, very good, ironically. And I think this has had a lifelong effect, because I think the children that I knew I was friendly with were actually Catholics. And the people, like the priest, stopping and smiling at me, I still remember that look. He must have been about 80. Well, it seemed like that to me, you know, it was very, very young. But the image stuck in my mind of him smiling at me like little, you know, like little old men do when they're looking at a little girl, with such affection, and that made a great impact. And I've always had a soft spot for Catholics since, because of the way I was treated as a child, specifically by Catholics, in that Catholic parents were allowing me to play with the children, and when I went into their homes I felt totally accepted as a Jew. I never felt they thought I was weird or strange, and I never heard anything from these Catholic children that was anti-Semitic. So ironically, my experience of Catholics was very, very positive as a child. But however, as a Jewish believer in Jesus, my experiences have been very bad, and it's come from the Protestant side of Christianity, which is kind of ironical. I do remember when I was moving forward, we're sort of moving a bit away from the subject slightly, but it's a train of thought I'm following. But when I was a Jewish believer, a friend of mine who was an evangelical Christian, non-Jewish, converted to Catholicism, and I went to visit her, and she was going to the Mass, and I'd never been in a Catholic church before, and she said, come along, and she felt it was important that I should be allowed to take the Mass, the sacrament. She had a word with the priest. Now the priest, I have to be careful because I don't want him to be identified, because he would still be alive. But he was already in trouble. He'd been what's called put out to in the desert. In other words, he was a man with a mind of his own. And he'd obviously had a disagreement with the Catholic authorities, and so he was moved from the city, a church in the city, to a church in the back of beyond, in the middle of nowhere, because that's what they do, churches. When they have somebody causing problems, they move them out into what's called the desert. the wilderness. The idea is put them somewhere where they can't do any damage, a little village in the middle of nowhere. Put them in a church which is very few people attend and they can't do much damage. So he was in this little church stuck in the middle of nowhere in a place I'd never heard of. And this Catholic friend now, went to the priest and said, Jane is, Deborah is Jewish, and she's accepted Jesus as a Messiah, and can she take the Mass? And he said yes. But he knew I wasn't a Catholic. But this was a man who was already breaking rules. So this Catholic priest allowed me to take the sacrament, which is incredibly brave of him, because I'm telling you, if the Catholic authorities had found out, he would have been sacked. There's no doubt. He would have been sacked completely from the Catholic Church. I wasn't going to become a Catholic. I wasn't a Catholic, and he allowed me to take the sacrament. Now, what happened, one of the ladies in the congregation complained to him about this, not because she was anti-Semitic, was because she said I hadn't become a Catholic. She was of the opinion that I should become a Catholic before I take the Mass. You shouldn't take the bread and wine if you haven't had Catholic instruction. I understand and respect that from her point of view. But this priest was willing to be sacked, to lose his very job, to give the sacrament to me, a Jewish person in Jesus, and which was quite something for him to do, from his point of view, because he could have got the sack. And, even now, if they got to hear about it, the Catholic Church, he would be disciplined for it. I mean, it would make life very uncomfortable for him. But he was prepared to do that. And so, even as a Jewish believer in Jesus, I found my experience with Catholics was actually very, very good. For a short time as a Jewish believer in Jesus, I was actually attending a Catholic church. I kept to myself. I didn't want to. I was fed up of religion by that time, and I was fed up of church life, and I wasn't interested in getting involved in the church. I still believed Jesus was the Messiah. I just wanted to go to the service and go home. I wasn't interested in getting to know people. But even there, I spoke with a Catholic priest, and I said, am I allowed to take the sacrament? He looked very embarrassed. He said, I'm terribly sorry, I'm not allowed. And he was very embarrassed about it. I could tell he wanted to say yes. The priest wanted to say yes. He said, I'm so sorry, I'm not allowed to do it. And I look, but there was no anti-Semitism. It was really nice. He would say, look, you can come forward for the blessing, I'll bless you, but I'm not allowed to do it. And I thought, well, it's his job at the end of the day. He'll get the sack. It's a very difficult position, because it was quite obvious he was told he wanted to give the sacrament to me as a Jew. He knew that I wouldn't want to convert to Catholicism, but he, again, he was wrestling with himself, and so I used to go forward for the blessing. So again, it was very, very positive. Of all the Catholics that I've known in my life, it's always been positive. And I think maybe one of the reasons is perhaps they have learnt from their own history. They know what the Catholic Church in the past has done to the Jewish people, and they now want nothing to do with anti-Semitism. And so my experience all through my life from Catholics, all the Catholics I've ever met, has always been very, very positive. As a Jewish person, I have not even had a whiff of a hint of anti-Semitism from a Catholic. But I'm sorry to say, where I've experienced anti-Semitism is on the non-Catholic side of the church. I am sorry for deviating, because this is what you want to know about my childhood view of Jesus. But I think the way I felt about him was a contributory aspect for me, in the sense of being to make that decision of accepting him, you see, because somewhere in the psyche, my psyche, I am seeing this figure, smiling figure, holding a lantern, looking very sweet, kind of understanding, right? He looks very nice, and I'm taken up with the nuns, aren't I? All of that. The religious life of the Catholic life of becoming a nun and praying to God and bowing on your knees and prostrating yourself like in the nun story and all of that, the Sound of Music. All of this, the Sound of Music had a terrific effect on me. Again, it got me thinking, I'd love to be a nun. I wish I could be a nun. It's a shame I can't be a Jewish nun. I remember thinking that as a child. So it's a very strange thing, but I think possibly that these impressions that I had and these yearnings of wanting to be a nun as a child, being so taken up with the nun story and, oh, I'd love to be a nun, and why can't we have Jewish nuns, and if I could be a Jewish nun, I would be a Jewish nun. I remember really wanting that as a child. I thought, I'd love to be a Jewish nun. And I remember asking somebody, why can't we be a Jewish nun? So I'm being really, really honest with you, because I think from a psychological aspect, I think it just gives us an insight into the conversion process, and that it's not cut and dry necessarily that a Jewish person picks up the Bible and reads this and believes that and believes that and believes this. I think perhaps with some people like me, it's multi-layered. In other words, there's things going on in the childhood impressions, good impressions as well as bad impressions. And so maybe I think this played a part in my accepting Jesus, because if all my childhood experiences of Jesus had been 100% negative, then I might still have not accepted him, you see. I'm so embarrassed at how gullible I was, because I just accepted everything that I read in the New Testament. I remember looking at the prophecies and things, and the first thing that struck me was that this does not make sense. I read everything in context, as you do, and I remember thinking, none of this makes sense. I don't understand it. But I was very, very much being brought up to respect my elders. I was brought up very, very strictly. A child is to be seen and not heard. A child doesn't have an opinion. You do as you're told. People older than you know better than you. So I was very much one for submitting to authority. And I think that was part of my upbringing, submit to authority. So I'm thinking to myself, none of what I'm reading makes sense within the context of these prophecies. But I'm thinking to myself, well, all these Catholics believe it. How could they all be wrong? And the Jewish people right? So I was giving deference to Catholicism, thinking they must be right, and we, the Jewish people, must be wrong. I had no Jewish concept. I've never been taught anything much about the Messiah. I just knew it was some figure that was supposed to come at some point. But, it was all very much, it seemed to me like a child. It was like a longed for hope, but somehow you weren't really sure what this Messiah was supposed to be doing. In the 1960s was a concept of a messianic age, but I understood that when I was at a Jewish school there would be a messianic age but no Messiah. And then I heard there was going to be a Messiah but no messianic age. Then I heard the theory of two Messiahs. But you see, this was all rumours and different things that we used to discuss about ourselves at the Jewish school, but we weren't actually, nothing was actually explained. And so I had nothing really to compare it to, because I didn't have a strong concept in my mind of what the Messiah was supposed to be or what the Messianic age was supposed to be. There was nothing very strongly imprinted on my mind. I mean, this is extraordinary when I went to think that I went to a Jewish school and I wasn't left with a strong impression of what the Messiah should be or what the Messianic, of nothing. It seemed that it seemed to me that the idea of the concept in the Messianic age and everything to do with the Messiah was all ideas, different ideas, and that everybody could have their own opinion on the Messiah, and it was okay, and nobody really knew, and it was all debatable anyway. And I'm so sorry for veering off the subject, which I have a habit of doing, but I hope this will, when I listen back, that this works together to give you the childhood view of Jesus. And when I think about that image, he is very appealing. Now, this image of the gentle Jesus does not add up in Scripture to my mind. When I look at the New Testament, I do not see a gentle Jesus. To me, this is a myth, but Christians believe this. But I never thought, when I was a Jewish believer in Jesus, I don't know that you told he's gentle. So it's almost like a myth that I began to believe this myth that Jesus was gentle. But when you look at the scriptures, there's nothing gentle about Jesus. I think in the scriptures, Jesus comes across as extremely harsh, tyrannical, judgmental, dogmatic, frightening, unapproachable, and not the least bit gentle. And in my mind, when I think of Jesus, I've got one side of the brain is like gentle Jesus, sweetness and light. You know, you can say anything to Jesus. He's like the mummy figure. Like, God is like Father. Yeah, wait till you come home, you know. He's like Father, the parental father, who you must, you know, the authoritarian father. You know, he's the one that's going to judge you at the end of the day. He's the one that decides if you're going to heaven or hell. God is the one you've got to be scared of. And Jesus is like mummy. Jesus is like all sweetness and light, and he's so gentle, he's so understanding. You can say anything to Jesus, he's all right, he'll forgive you, can do anything, you can say anything. And evangelical Christians do behave when they talk about Jesus. They see him as a pushover, basically. They see Jesus as a pushover. You can say anything, do anything, he's all right, Jesus. Just say you're sorry and you'll be all right. So you've got this mythical figure of Jesus whose sweetness and light, he's all understanding and gentle. You can say anything and do anything. Just say you're sorry and he's all right and he'll forgive you. However, you've got God is the one who's to be feared. But when you actually look at them, you look at the figure of Jesus and the things he says in the New Testament, he is quite a frightening and forbidding figure. And I can't see anything gentle about him when you actually read the scriptures. What I see in Jesus is a very complex figure. I think he's very multi-layered. He's very multi-layered. I think when I read that as a character in a novel, I think he's quite a complex character. I think he has ideas of grandeur. I think he has a personality problem. I don't think he relates well to people. I think he's very severe. I think he's judgmental. I think he has ideas of grandeur. I think he is intolerant. I don't think he's a good communicator. In other words, when I look at Jesus as a character in the Gospels, to me it's totally opposite to the myth of Jesus that is prevalent and believed in the Christian evangelical culture. This myth of the gentle sweetness of light, you know, the man holding the lantern, all sweetness and light. And I think possibly somewhere in my mind throughout the time that I was a believer in Jesus, you've got this childhood image of the gentle Jesus from the Christmas cards, the Easter cards, and all of that, the imagery, the films, and you just what the carols and everything. This sweet Jesus, he's so forgiving, he's so nice, he's always nice. Jesus is always nice, he forgives anything, say anything, you do anything, you know. And the concept of Jesus is so different from the concept of God, because you ask anybody, most people know that God is the one you are to fear. God is the one who will pronounce a sound judgment in this world. God is the one you're to fear if you're doing wickedness and evil in the world. God is to fear if you're the one who's going to consider murdering somebody. God is the one to be feared if you're running a paedophile ring. But when it comes to Jesus, no, you're running a paedophile ring, and Jesus is all sweetness and light, and he will forgive you, and he's just smiling at you, and he's all understanding. And so we've got these two different concepts of God, and they don't sit comfortably together, I don't think, because really the Jesus of the Bible, of the Gospels, is really quite intolerant of wrongdoing. But this is not part of the culture. It's and I do wonder that the weakness of Christianity is that the image of Jesus which they've constructed of this gentle figure who's basically, you can do anything and say anything and he'll forgive you and everything's all right. And you never get the feeling there's a consequence to your actions with Jesus. It's like you're just saying you're sorry and you're all right, you know. And human beings, I think, do need to know there is a consequence for when you do wrong. And I think the world's view of God is the fact that there is a consequence to wrongdoing. I think people know that. However they perceive of God, they know God is not a soft touch. In people's psyche, God is the one to be feared. God is the one who you should be afraid of, because I think in people's minds, people know right and wrong, good and evil, and they know that this God that's in existence is not a soft touch. He's not just going to pat you on the head and say, it's all right, you can just say you're sorry and it's okay. You know, it's like, it's all blown over. I think the God of the Bible is more somebody to be reckoned with. And I think a God who takes wrongdoing more seriously, because the Christianity's God of Jesus doesn't really take wrongdoing seriously. It's just a case of say you're sorry and you're all right. Do it again, say you're sorry again. And you do get this attitude from Christians that I think they just take him for a mug, basically. And although they say they want to lead holy lives, because they take this forgiveness for granted so much, that it does affect their behaviour, in that they just make, in my long experience of 42 years, is although they're talking the talk, they don't necessarily walk the walk, and they just say to themselves, well, Jesus will forgive me, Jesus will forgive me. I do remember a woman saying to me, one phrase you will hear all Christians, evangelical Christians, say is, I'm sure God will understand. Well, not God, they'll say the Lord. And you don't know who they mean when they say the Lord. You don't know if they mean God or Jesus. But the most common phrase evangelical Christians will say, I'm sure the Lord will understand. I remember a lady saying that she spent, this is decades ago, £60 on a pair of shoes. This is decades ago. This is what she said. I remember the words. She said, I knew I shouldn't spend so much money on a pair of shoes, but I did, and I am sure the Lord will understand. And that's what all Christians say when they do things that they, by their own conscience, they know they shouldn't perhaps be doing. They will always say, I know I shouldn't have said this, I know I shouldn't have said that, but the Lord, I presume they mean Jesus, will forgive them. In other words, they're doing wrong, they know it's wrong, they say wrong, but they just say to themselves, well, Jesus will forgive me, Jesus will forgive me. And I think this is where you get this cultural thinking of really taking God for a mug. in that they just say they're sorry and everything's all right. And they even as they're doing something or saying something that's wrong, they will say, how many times evangelical Christians say, I said this, I knew it was wrong, but I said it anyway. Christians, how many times I've heard of evangelical Christians say to me, I did this, I knew it was wrong, I knew the Lord wouldn't like it, but I did it anyway. And I'm sure the Lord will forgive me. That you hear all the time. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard that during 42 years. And I suppose this gets back to our image of Jesus. Because for the Christian, the image of Jesus becomes the image of God. Because they believe Jesus is God. And so they're taking him as they're just taking him for a mug. It's absolutely appalling. I mean, I felt like saying I would now. Well, I'm sure God understands why you've committed adultery. He understands you're in a very unhappy marriage. He understands it. But committing adultery is not the way to deal with an unhappy marriage. And God would not. How can God be? It's like God's all right with it. I have committed adultery, but because God can understand the reasons why I've committed adultery, therefore he'll turn a blind eye and it's all right. I've heard people say this. I heard of a woman having an affair with a married man, and she said to me, I am sure the Lord will understand. And I didn't say it, but I would now. And I felt like saying to her, yes, I'm sure he understands that you're in love with this married man. But he would say to you, I understand you're in love with this married man, but you must not have sex with him. He's not your husband. You must walk away. You must stop seeing him. I know you're going to be very unhappy. You'll be crying every night in bed. You're going to feel dreadful, but this is the right thing to do. But no, this evangelical born-again Christian was saying, I am sure God will understand. And it's coming from this image, this gentle Jesus image, basically, of somebody you can say and do anything with, and he's all sweetness, and he'll pat you on the head and say, it's all right, I'll forgive you. I understand you're in love with this married man, it's all right. And this is what Christianity, in the outworking of it, I've seen it so much, and it is quite shocking. And I don't think they have within Christianity has the evangelical Christianity has a healthy concept of repentance. I mean, a healthy one. A resolution of saying what I just said was wrong, and I've got to step up and I've got to start watching my temper. I have got to make some changes here. In other words, I don't get the impression that people are really serious. They talk the talk, but I don't get it somehow that it's coming from deep within, that they are committed to actually really changing and doing something about it. They're just talking the walk. I want to glorify God. I want to glorify God. But then they're going and meeting with a married man. Right. They know they shouldn't be meeting this married man. And they'll say, I'm sure the Lord will understand. And no Christian will challenge them on that and say, well, no, this is ridiculous. Yes, the Lord understands you're lonely. The Lord understands you're in love with this man. The Lord understands you don't want to be, on the shelf and unmarried, but you still must not do this, and it's wrong. And I suppose this all gets back to the teaching within Christianity, evangelical Christianity, which I think is very, very poor. They don't sort of help people to think round the box. And when I look at the Jesus in the Gospels and the Jesus that people talk about, evangelical Christianity, it doesn't tally. It doesn't tally. And I've come to the conclusion that people, after 42 years within all of my experience of evangelical Christianity, the whole of Christianity, is that people are constructing God and Jesus into the image that they want him to be. They are turning him into the image that they want him to be. That they are almost refusing to accept what the Bible says about him, or what it clearly reveals about his nature, and they're clinging on to this image that they construct in their minds, perhaps like a child, and they're saying, no, God is not going to be angry with me because I'm having an affair with a married man. No, God is all forgiving. He's all forgiving. He's loving. God is loving. God is loving. So they focus on this loving God, and they totally forget that they're accountable to him. And God has said, made it quite clear, you don't have an affair with a married man. And I think this is about, the Christian seems to me very muddled often. And this is again with poor teaching within the church. And it seems to me that everybody has their own definition of God, and they're following and they're believing God is something which seems to be contrary to how he reveals himself in the Bible. And it gets back to this gentle Jesus, which would be so nice, which I kind of, half of me still has that image of the gentle Jesus. But the reality is, when I look at what he says in the New Testament Gospels, it's absolutely shocking. There's nothing gentle about him. I see a very vicious, intolerant, stern man. A man who says, if I don't believe in him, I'm going to go to hell. A man who says, everything about him speaks of I think he's quite a terrifying figure. When I read some of the things now, I read and I think, that is quite terrifying, the things he's saying. And he's very, very severe. And he seems often to be in a bit of a temper, and when I look at Jesus as a character in a novel, because I love reading, I'm a great reader, I look at him as a character in a novel. I don't think he's an attractive figure. I don't think there's anything attractive about Jesus. I'm speaking honestly, as looking at him as a figure in a novel. I think he's quite frightening. And I don't think there's anything gentle about him at all. And I think he's very complex. And it's like, who is the real Jesus? And this is what Christians are trying to fathom. And everybody has their own mindset, psyche, deep within their psyche, this image of their own Jesus. And I think people are reconstructing this image of how they want him to be. They're wanting to have a God who they can say and do anything, and they're just going to pat them on the head and say, it's okay, it's all right, I understand you, you're forgiven. But does that tally with the nature and the way God has seen to be acting in history through the Hebrew scriptures? So we have to question this against how God works in history and what he's saying in the Hebrew scriptures. And we have to be more honest about God, and to balance things out. And I think the worst thing and the most damaging thing about Christianity is I don't think they're able to balance out the nature and character of God. I feel it's totally skew. And I think it's the lack of a Jewish mind in Christianity. It has resulted, this mindset has resulted because they haven't had the Jewish mind in Christianity. And what happens is, when Jewish people believe in Jesus, they accept the whole of Christianity and Christian thought, and they become converted in the way they think when they become a Christian. Because I used to think 40 years ago that if a Jewish person believed in Jesus, that they would have something to offer Christianity. They would be able to bring in the Jewish aspect into Christianity. But what I realised after 40 years, this is not how it works in practice. What happens is a Jewish person accepts Jesus, they then take on board all of the New Testament, they accept everything as being from God from the New Testament, and they accept all Christian thought. So their whole view of Judaism and of the Hebrew scriptures is now perverted. So they're looking at their own people, their own history, their own scriptures through the eyes of St. Paul, through the eyes of Catholic tradition, through the eyes of the Christian tradition. So Christianity doesn't want any Jewish input because Christianity is opposed to Judaism. It considers the law, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, as totally useless. Paul considers it excrement. They consider Talmud useless, rubbish, nothing to offer. They have a total, utter contempt for the law of God given to the Jewish people. This is the laws of God. They have contempt for the very laws of God given to the Jewish people. This is what's so crazy. And this all comes from St. Paul, who was a Jew. But this is a rogue Jew who's developed his own little religion, because the ideas of St. Paul have created a new religion, a new thought. It's a different religion. And the idea of Christianity being a fulfillment of Judaism is a load of rubbish, because Judaism does not need fulfilling. It is complete in of itself. It has all that it needs. It is complete in of itself. But when a Jewish person starts to believe in Jesus, they are taking on board all the Christian ideas. And this is what's so awful. And they end up losing respect for the religion of Judaism from which they were brought up into, or, born into. They start to look down on it. What they perhaps tend to do is pick and choose festivals. Oh, we like this festival. We'll celebrate the Jewish New Year. We'll celebrate this. We'll celebrate that. And then they start reading things into Scripture, or reading things into the Passover, which are Christian, and it gets all perverted. And so, I was thinking the other day how Christians take the Hebrew Scriptures and pervert them. They pervert them. They take that which is written in the Hebrew Scriptures and misapply them. For instance, spare the rod and spoil the child. It is not part of Judaism to beat and to be cruel to children. It is not part of any aspect of Judaism to beat and be cruel to children. It's unthinkable. And yet we know Christianity has a history of being very cruel, especially to children. Children being brought up in Christianity, evangelical Christianity, and Catholicism even, where the parents are so cruel. They beat the children. They literally beat the children. They read things into the Hebrew Scriptures, they take it literally, and they beat the children. And it seems to me that Christianity has a wonderful knack of perverting everything in the Hebrew Bible. And this is what's so shocking about Christianity, is it takes the Hebrew Scriptures and perverts them. It's awful, awful, because there is just no concept in Judaism of beating children, of being cruel to children, of the way that the nuns have been cruel to children in convents, the way, Christian brothers have perhaps been, some of them, cruel to Catholic boys. And that the whole of Christianity seems to be so often a very cruel religion, that the way it outworks itself, it's cold, it's hard, It's lacking warmth. And any warmth that it does get, it goes to the opposite extreme, right? Because Christianity seems to go either it's vicious, cruel, intolerant, inflicting pain and punishment, condemnation and wrath, or it goes the opposite extreme, and it's suddenly all soft, feely, touchy, lovey, dovey, you can get away with anything, and God is so sweet, and Jesus is so sweet, and he'll just forgive you, and he's so understanding. And it's so like Christianity is so mixed up about how it views God, and it alternates. And this all boils down to how you perceive God, because how you perceive God will affect how you treat people and how you treat yourself and how your culture. So we all know the hell and brimstone God, but that's one side of Christianity. But then you've got the other side of Christianity, the sentimental, soft, emotional. Jesus wants me for a sunbeam. He's so gentle and sweet, and he understands everybody, and he'll just forgive you. Just say you're sorry, and you do it again. You just say you're sorry, and he never gets annoyed with you, and he's always sweet. And this all comes from how you are seeing God in your mind and what you're being taught about God, what you're picking up even as a small child, that you live in a society. And so I'm hoping this all, what I'm telling you, I know I seem to be wandered to the left and wandered to the right, but I'm hoping when I hear this back that it will kind of pull together and get you thinking about your childhood influences and even your adult influences and the contradictions and how you perceive God, that really does affect how you regard yourself, how you treat one another, and really what is true. Or do you really, Christians claim to know God inside out, the back of their head, and they claim to know the mind of God, and they know Jesus inside out, back to front. But what I've realised, I don't know either. This Jesus is sort of a myth figure, and this, I don't know. I don't know. And who has a handle on God? Who knows the fullness of God? And isn't it very arrogant to presume that you know everything about God because he's answered a few prayers? It doesn't mean that you know everything about God. And human beings are hard enough to understand. How many married couples do you know that have been married 50 years and they still surprise each other? They still surprise each other. I'm surprised you said that. I'm surprised he did that. You think you know somebody and then you suddenly find you don't know them as well as you thought. And perhaps if we think like this regarding God, we'll be a bit more humble and a bit more respectful of God, and not to take him too much for granted, and to show a bit more awe for God, and to be willing to reevaluate the nature and character of God, and always be willing to look at it against Scripture, test it against Scripture, and to be able to look at things as a whole. And I think I think since I've been listening to the rabbis more, it has been broadening my mind about God much more than it has about Christianity. All I've ever heard in Christianity is love, 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 forgive, forgive, forgive. You don't hear anything about judgment. You don't hear anything about personal responsibility. You don't hear anything about really what repentance is about and how it should be outworking itself. And And I am so glad to be away from Christianity and to be listening to my rich Jewish heritage now, and to be getting tuned with that. And I feel it's developing and helping me to grow and understand God, because we're all learning and nobody has arrived.